penultimate this year's seminar series. It is being recorded, so I should say this every week, and I keep forgetting. If there's something you don't want made public, please don't say anything, because we're going to put this onto the Institute of African Studies website at some point, and people do look at the seminars, and some use it for teaching as well. So welcome to all of you. It's lovely to see old friends and make new friends. We're talking about this book. I'll say, but I always say, judge a book by its cover. Cover design matters. This one is beautiful. Claudia Gastrow's book, The Aesthetics of Belonging, Indigenous Urbanism and City Building in Oil Boom Luanda. And even in the title, what we see is Claudia's juxtaposition of terms that don't often go together. So let me just welcome the author and the two discussants, and to say to all of you who don't know me, I'm Shireen Hassim. I'm the Canada 150 Research Chair at Carleton, and this is a seminar series that we run every fall. So do look out for next week's seminar, which is by Antasha Reka Epstein's book on Madagascar. And then next semester, I can tell you that we already have too many books to accommodate. So it's all very exciting. Claudia Gastrow is an urban anthropologist who teaches at North Carolina State University. She joined there as assistant professor. Previously, she was at the University of Johannesburg, did her PhD at Chicago, and is just this really wonderful creative thinker about I think of Claudia sometimes your work as kind of urban anthropological work on politics, really, and on the state, and it sort of speaks to audiences well outside of anthropology, also to the very large body of literature that is now developing on African cities, and ways of rethinking all of those received ideas about how to make how to change our societies, and a kind of critique of progressivism. Many of you here will also know Claudia as a member of the board of the African Studies Association in the US, and a part of the editorial team of the African Studies Review. We have two almost perfect discussants for this book, as often happens. Joining us from the University of California in Irvine is Antonio Tomas. And Antonio's own work is also on urbanism and Angola. He has written a book called The Skin of the City, Spatial Transformation in Luanda. And his other work explores similar themes to Claudia's, but from a somewhat different angle: colonialism, race. He has worked on Amilcar Cabral. And now, Antonio, I believe you're working on the 1975 border war between South Africa and Angola, which I'm extremely interested in. So welcome, Antonio. And then the discussant from Queen's University, formerly from Carleton University, our dear colleague, much missed at Carleton, Grace, Adeniyi-Ogunyankin. We do really miss you. I really miss you being down the corridor. She is an associate professor of geography at Queen's University. She holds a Canada Research Chair in Youth and African Futures. And her work is, I know your work especially well on gender and consumption in African cities, Grace, but your new book sounds also interesting, the book that you're busy working on, The Prophetic Spectacular, Global Urbanism, Identity, and Africa's Rise. So welcome to all three of you. We're going to begin, as we usually do, with Claudia telling us about the book, about the key ideas in the book, and giving us a sense of its scope and its multiple ways in which it approaches the notion of aesthetics and the urban. So, Claudia, I'm going to hand over to you, and you can share your slides if you so wish.
Yes, I didn't initially plan to share slides, but when I came on early, Shireen encouraged me. So I'll try to make them sync up with what I'd actually prepared in terms of my talk. But if there's not an exact match, yeah, I'll just have a little bit of, oh, hold on. Let me just open the slideshow first. It's not a confusion. Okay. Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thank you for whichever time zone you are, making the time to come to this kind of discussion and presentation. All three, Shireen, Grace, and Antonio, thank you so much for being here. Shireen has been a supporter of my, I don't want to quite say research because I can't go back that far, but let's say a supporter of my intellectual endeavors since I was actually about 4, I think. So I have a long history of indebtedness to Shireen of care and support. Thank you very much for that. When I was asked who I would like to be discussants, both Grace and Antonio were extremely high up, if I might say, the top 2 on my list. Grace's work has, for me, been really important in kind of thinking about many of the kinds of dynamics that I discuss in this class, in this book. And Antonio, actually, without him, I would never have been able to do my initial research in Angola. He actually wrote the letter, like what they call a carta de chamada, like a invitation letter to go and do my first very short stint of research in 2008. And so the debt is substantive, and I've been very lucky to have him as a kind of friend and discussant on this journey. So thank you. And of course, thank you also to the Institute of African Studies at Carleton for contributing to this. So I'm going to start just with a little bit, I guess, of the history of how the book came about. When Shireen kind of wrote to me, she said the idea was kind of to present the main ideas, but also give people a sense of the journey that led to the book, where it came from. And so, as with many first books, this kind of grew out of my PhD dissertation. But even how I got there is kind of a little bit of a windy path. My undergraduate and my master's were not an anthropologist. I was not an anthropologist by training. I was a historian and still sometimes like to think of myself as such. And when I decided to work on Luanda, in some ways, it was also a little bit arbitrary, if I have to be honest. I was interested in African urbanism. I had majored in African history, but not South African history, as an undergraduate and in my MA studies. And I really wanted to look at kind of process of urbanization beyond South Africa. I wanted to kind of challenge myself, understand more of the continent that I was from, try and think more regionally, more Pan-African, more in a Pan-African way. And one of my close friends when I was doing my MA was not Angolan, but had grown up in Angola and had recently gone back and had kind of told me about what was happening in the city and its transformation after the war. And so I sort of applied for PhD programs, promising to do research in a place that I had not been. And so I am very lucky that it worked out. And my initial idea, I'd been very inspired by kind of the anthropology and history literature that it was sort of really present in the late 90s, early 2000s. And my idea originally had been to kind of do a transnational Angola-Portugal study, thinking about memories of colonialism across the Atlantic. And when I went to Angola for the first time, which was during the 2008 election, actually the first election after the Civil War, the first place a friend of mine took me was to kind of a tent on their promenade, which had this little maquette of the plan for what the promenade was meant to look like at the Marginal once it had been redeveloped. And so my plans sort of quickly changed. I became really interested in how the city itself, without kind of a specific reference to Portugal, was changing, what was driving it. And eventually kind of arrived in 2011 for my sort of longer term fieldwork, if you want, with the idea of really looking at people who'd experienced, if you want, what would very often be described as kind of the underbelly of urban development, people who'd been subject to these mass demolitions. And demolition really was one of the most common features of urban redevelopment in Angola. Some of them were huge, like 15,000 houses. Some of them almost were kind of designed to nibble around the edges of areas, 100 houses here, 50 houses there. When a flood came, people would be removed and put in a resettlement zone. And so they were sort of happening every day at different scales, sometimes small, sometimes big, sometimes noticed, sometimes not. And so I was really interested, and I described some of this in the book, and really trying to think about how people's relationship to the state was being transformed and during this process of urban redevelopment, which was really kind of this is not letting me, there we go, which was really happening kind of across the continent at the time. And I think you can look, there's a vast literature on kind of new cities, mega infrastructure investment in Senegal, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Ghana. So Luanda was really part of that wave. And so kind of the broader question was, given that we were seeing the emergence of all these sort of new forms of urban development, the return of master planning, the return of large infrastructural investment in Africa, what did it feel like from the ground up? But the responses I got were not what I was necessarily expecting. And I think that's really where this book comes from. There's a very long literature which looks at the question of aesthetics during oil booms, for instance. And Luanda was in the midst of an oil boom. Its civil war, it ended in 2002. The price of oil in 2002 was $24 a barrel. By 2011, it was $110 a barrel. Okay, so the state, which had come out of a 27-year-long civil war, which had been predated by one of the most violent anti-colonial wars on the continent. Okay, so really a state which had been in a position of war for almost 5 decades, really had this moment to sort of experience peace and think about what that could bring with it. And with that came this massive investment in what the Angolan state called national reconstruction, which was really broadly sort of an umbrella term for a mixture of projects in large-scale housing provision and large-scale infrastructure provision across the country, but in many ways centered on the capital, Luanda, where the book takes place. And this was sort of paralleled by the sorts of private investment that follow an oil boom. And so it became very clear that there was sort of an aesthetic politics on the part of the state. Okay, and I'll explain in a moment what I mean by aesthetics and what I mean by an aesthetic politics, and where I see the book kind of differentiating itself. But what I came to see very quickly from my interviews, when I started interviewing people, when I started kind of sitting in on meetings of people who'd had their homes demolished, people who expected their homes to be demolished, was in a way not what I expected. I expected stories of sort of loss, memory, lamenting of kind of movement, employment, poor treatment by the government. These are things which we find when we across the continent when one engages with people who've lost their homes or been deprived of their homes because of demolitions. But the constant refrain which came back to me was actually about the building materials that people's homes had been made of. So was it from concrete block? Was it corrugated iron? Complaints about new government houses having roofs that were too low? And again, repeatedly that people, quote unquote, wouldn't be as opposed to demolition, would still have issues with it, if, for instance, the government would give them finances and materials to build their own homes rather than putting them in a government house, which many kind of felt was very poorly designed for their desires or in comparison to the current homes that they have. I'm going to flag that this was kind of during that period of demolition. Many of the areas which were built at the time are now kind of are full. People have remade their houses. But this was a period when kind of knowing what would become of these areas was very uncertain. And so the question for a lot of people really hinged off what became very clear to me was a politics of materiality and a broader politics of what I call like, urban aesthetics or an aesthetics of belonging. And by the term aesthetics, I'm really meaning two things. So the one is probably what would be most familiar to people, even in kind of the everyday use of aesthetics. So design, thinking something is beautiful, the materials that we look at, okay? So that's kind of a general, we think of art, we think of architecture, we think of what things are made of. So yes, people were describing that. They were complaining about the design of certain buildings. They were praising the designs of others. They were showing a preference for certain kinds of construction materials or thinking about quality. But there's also literature on aesthetics, which thinks about it in terms of kind of our sensory apprehension of the world and the way in which that shapes the ideas that we have of kind of beautiful or ugly, desirable, comfortable, okay? So there's an aesthetics which revolves around, one could call it embodiment, but it's not just embodiment. It's kind of sensorial apprehension, which is historically constituted, which is politically constituted, and the ways in which that shapes our shared understandings of and our norms of what is recognizable as kind of part of a particular category, what is beautiful, what is desirable. And this matters for urban centers because we tend to walk around, in fact, with an implicit aesthetics of urbanism, if you want. We tend to share in certain parts of the world, or even internationally to a certain extent, normative ideas about what a good city looks like, what a good building looks like, and therefore what belongs in a building and what can be, what belongs in a city and what can be removed from a city, really based off our aesthetic judgments. And so one part of what the book looks at is really the kinds of political relations which emerge from what I really see not so much as kind of clashing aesthetic judgments, although they do clash at times. But if you want, two kind of parallel ways of inhabiting the city, which in the book I make the case for having emerged, in the moment of kind of the Atlantic slave trade and sort of moving forward as a parallel process of building. One kind of a formalizing logic, one which sort of encapsulates nowadays these sort of world city international planning norms, and the other which we've tended, at least in Africa, to call informality. And this then was one of the other kind of interventions of the book, was trying to understand areas like what in Angola are called musex beyond the category of informality. And this wasn't just kind of a move to say like, oh, these areas also count. There's been a large literature from the early 2000s in kind of rethinking African cities, which has really emphasized the importance of kind of the ephemeral and the provisional. And this is an incredibly important literature. It was a literature that was needed for kind of turning around what were really imaginations of especially economic informality, which were used to portray African cities as kind of falling behind world development, as in need of intervention, as chaotic. And there's kind of, I'm sure people know the work by Abdelmalik Simone, work by Philippe de Buc, and many others, which really worked hard to make us rethink economic informality. But my concern was that this had been at the kind of, this turn to kind of rejuvenating the economic and the ephemeral had kind of sacrificed the material to make this point. And very often what you've seen in this work is actually an implicit assumption that people survive despite the material environments in which they're found. A lot of this work is described kind of informality, if you want, as liquid, as movable, as lacking kind of a political base. And so part of what the book is trying to do is kind of reassert a longer trajectory of these processes of construction through which the musex, which I described, emerged from, show that there's a political identity and political stake in the city. And to kind of frame this, I redescribe the musex as, sorry, my thickness.
You've muted yourself, Claudia.
I don't know how I did that. So I reframe to kind of make a case for the political significance of these areas, and in fact, the material politics that emerges from them and the aesthetic politics that emerges from them. I reframe them, or I tried to analyze them as what I'm calling an indigenous urbanism. And I imagine this will be kind of one of the more controversial points of the book, partially because the concept of indigeneity has been a controversial one in African studies. Some people are uncomfortable with it. Some African states are uncomfortable with it. But I did look towards a lot of the literature that has come, especially out of North America, and in fact, the Canadian Academy on indigeneity and indigenous urbanism in the North American context. And I think what I found very productive, which provided a space in ways that I felt some of the literature coming from African studies does not, was the understanding that kind of a notion of indigeneity did not just revert back to an ethnic identity, which is very often the way it's been treated in African studies, but emerged in two ways. One, as like a relational identity, an identity which emerged through relation to place and land. And another one is a political position. And if you think of Musex or other areas around them, they are politically positioned to formality in a sometimes oppositional, not always oppositional way, but it is by kind of identifying them as a form of construction which emerged from African experiences of urbanism. It provides a way of kind of locating histories of building, political relations, and more complex relations to the state than kind of just referring to them as informal did. Kind of gives them a politics, a place-based politics, and an urban politics, and a claim by people who live there as being, if you want, urban autochthones, in ways that informality kind of glosses over, ignores, or doesn't really allow one to explore. And so ultimately what the book is trying to look at is kind of the ways that an aesthetic politics emerges from these indigenous urban spaces, and how that kind of complicated, not always resisted, but complicated the claims to kind of care and technological prowess and modernism that the state spectacle was kind of trying to perform. Because part of what that kind of claim from the state spectacle was trying to do was trying to proffer that it would offer comfort, care, aesthetic possibility to people who lived in these areas, assuming, of course, that there was nothing in those areas worth salvaging. And that's kind of the conversation that the book opens. And I think I've probably spoken enough. So I will turn over to either Grace or Antonio to pick up on the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Can we turn to Antonio first, and then you, Grace? Antonio.
First of all, Claudia, thank you so much, and Claudia, Shireen, and thank you so much for this opportunity to engage with your book, with your work. Yeah, you start saying, we how I sent you the invitation to visit Angola for the first time in 2008. And I remember that it was a critical time in Angola because everyone was convinced that elections would go wrong. And you asked me if it was a good moment to go to Angola. And I told you yes, because I was totally convinced that, that the war was over and that the war would not come back. And also, and I think that it's important to tell this story because I think a great part of what you write in this book comes out of this, not just in terms of your research, but really in terms of like the hopes and all the possibilities and all that happened to Angola, since the war finished. So it's a great opportunity, and I think it's I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be here. And and to congratulate you on this major achievement, something that you have been working for so long and with so much care and so on, and I've been following, in different ways, presentations and different forums we've taken part together. and commenting and using your work that you have, which has been very useful for me, the work that you have written on Angola and so on. So I think you said a lot about the book already, so I will not repeat what you have said. And I don't want to be here as someone who has written a book on the same subject, because I think that it would not take this conversation in a very interesting place. But I just, I think it's a phenomenal book. It's so well written. It's, thoroughly researched. And I just want to say something that Shireen mentioned, the ways in which you juxtapose, so many concepts that we don't, that hardly, we seen getting together in the same conversation. I like very much the discussions on aesthetics and so on, and how you relate, through through Rancière, how you relate the aesthetics with politics and so on, and which gives you a window, right, to talk about politics, talk about what is going on, talk about the presidential power, to talk about how the presidential has shaped the city, and how people respond back. I really think it's an engaging, and you bring so much, it's like it's really deep ethnography, because you talk to so many people, and then you bring these voices, and I think it's so important, and I think it's something that misses, that it's not out there in a lot of constructions, in a lot of theorizations of the urban moment in Africa, how sometimes we tend to impose our own voices on top of the voices of the people. We should be talking about their lives and their concerns and their problems and so on. I really like the way you talk about materiality, and I think particularly, in anthropology, we've been so preoccupied with ideas and ideologies and cosmologies and mythologies, the whole ways in which we talk about race, the ways in which we talk about ethnicity, comes from this idea, that these ideas shape the ways in which people behave. And I like, the very strong push you do in terms of considering the materiality of the thing, of these places, of the social fabric, right? And how to think of the city, how to think of the materials, how to think of infrastructure, to understand process of formation, to understand process of belonging, right? To understanding of process of self-affirmation in terms of aesthetics, how people position themselves in relation to the world. So I will just mention with that, I will just make and I think we will have more chances to talk more about other aspects of the book. But I would like to pick up something that you said, that your idea, your discussion on the concept of indigeneity, would be controversial, and I think you have already engage with this question, perhaps, and I think you can perhaps say more about that, because it's intriguing the ways in which you talk about the concept of indigenous urbanism, and I think the concept of indigenous or indigeneity has become so central nowadays. In anthropology, particularly, in the ways in anthropology and social sciences, particularly in the ways in which, we understand what is going on in the world, and we use concepts of settler colonialism, and so on. And I think your discussion, you have a very strong position on these issues, and I think your discussion is very interesting. But I think I would like to ask because when we talk about indigenous, there is a history, a very charged history of the term indigenous in Angola, right? Because and I think if you want to talk about indigenous in Angola, you will get to this discussion. And I think just to give an idea of people who haven't heard of these discussions. So indigenous, or what the Portuguese called indigenato, was really, a legal apparatus that colonialism in Portugal created in order to divide the population in two, right? On one hand, the indigenous, on the other hand, the assimilados or civilized. So one thing about the indigenous is that people, they did not have rights, and they could be compelled, they could be conscripted to provide labor for free for, colonial and private enterprises and economic ventures and so on. And the term indigenous or indigena was only, and I will use the term in Portuguese, so that we not make confusion with, how we discuss the concept of indigeneity nowadays in this part of the world, right? In US academia, where I'm part of now. And then the law on indigenous was only abrogated in 1961 when the anti-colonial war started. So the Portuguese said, there is no more indigenous, so everyone is a Portuguese citizen and so on. So I think and I think I just want to hear, what you have to say about how to bring in, because these concepts are still there. If you use these concepts in Angola, assimilado, indígena, and civilizado, and so on, they have still, because people are still there, and they know what those concepts did, and they know what they have to do, to get these concepts, out of the political system, or how we're gonna call it. But I was just, so my question, and perhaps, if you can just say something more about that, how to bring the concept of indigenato in the ways in which the Portuguese conceived of, in conversation with the ways in which we talk about, indigeneity, settler colonialism, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonio. Grace, over to you.
All right. Thank you. Congratulations on your book. I really enjoyed reading it, so much so that I would bring it to my son's basketball game, and I would read it whenever they had timeout. And my son was wondering, what's up with this book? So congrats again. And I think what I'm going to focus on would be what I really enjoyed about your book, what I took from it, and some questions that I have, and also things that I'm really curious about in relation to how I was reading what you wrote, and your thoughts on the questions that are coming from my reading of what you wrote, if that makes sense. So I find that your book is well researched and it's engaging, and I really like that you had ample evidence and strongly argued points. For me, particularly because I know very little about Luanda, I enjoy learning about how the geography of enslavement shaped the city and its layered histories of fugitive urbanism. So I really thought that you did a solid job of providing context on national reconstruction, and you offered strong arguments for how national reconstruction centered aesthetic, but at the same time drew boundaries, making it exclusionary through the government's promotion of aesthetic inequality. I appreciated your discussions on music history and your critique of how, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, musekes have been rendered ungeographic. I also really appreciated that you didn't just end the book based on the oil construction boom, but you also talk about the aftermath of the oil boom in your conclusion chapter. Overall, I found your call to approach the African urban through the lens of sensorial citizenship / sensorial urbanism compelling, particularly because it adds more complexity to how we analyze African urbanism, African agency, and desire in the age of concrete and world-class city aesthetic. While reading, I was persuaded by your position on centering the politics of comfort. I like this focus on comfort because it enables us to move beyond the politics of survival as it pertains to marginalized urban population. And it also contributes to the increasingly expensive scope which we use to analyze African urban. What stayed with me, and I'm going to ask you, Shika, to please help me put the PowerPoint up now. What stayed with me and what I kept thinking about while I read your book was your discussion about alternative aesthetic orientations and your offering of the term aesthetic dissent. Thank you for that, by the way. And I, as you note, and I think it's worth quoting because it's really beautiful what you wrote, in order to experience inclusion, one's aesthetic worlds must be valued on their own terms. And particularly, I want to quote a large section of your conclusion just because I think it puts into context the images that I'm about to show. And the recognition of one's aesthetic life is also recognition of the value of that life. It is this recognition of the value of their lives and therefore the material expression thereof that the majority of Luandans have not enjoyed. Their contributions to the making of the city have been glossed historically as provisional, poorly constructed, and undesirable rather than recognized as spaces of meaningful urbanism. The histories they represent have not been grappled with. This majority has never been invited to explain what they want from a future city. This exclusion of the majority has been and will continue to be Luanda's primary political problem until such time as there is a means to not simply incorporate them into an overarching normative urbanism, but to readjust conceptualizations of the urban to recognize their contributions. The problem of urban megaprojects, arguably, is not simply that they are implemented by elites, but they are undemocratic in their aesthetic imaginations because they tend to emerge out of undemocratic processes. Only by taking seriously the aesthetic challenge provided by spaces, usually framed as deviant, namely the Museki and its counterparts across the globe, can we begin to track alternative locally emergent aesthetic visions of cities and the histories of power that has shaped our urbanscapes. In doing this, sites of struggle, love, intimacy, and community usually ignored by elite-dominated distributions of the sensible come into focus, end quote. So, Claudia, I couldn't help but wonder if prioritizing a politics of aesthetic dissent was somewhat in conversation with the right to opacity. That is, a right to opacity when it comes to aesthetics and values. What would a right to opacity look like in city-making projects in African urban spaces? What if this right to opacity asserts the value of Black space and affirms Black spatial agency, like that espoused by African architects like Francis Kere, Mariam Kamara, and Olaleka Jegifius? These three architects centered the indigenous culture, community, and harmony with the environment. They are also uninterested, as Kere architecture puts it, in ill-fitting imported models. Most importantly, these architects embrace stigmatized material, that is, those that may not be considered aesthetically pleasing by Eurocentric standards. For example, Francis Kere champions the use of clay, which is affordable and environmentally sustainable. He argues against the replacement of clay by concrete and promotes a reappropriation of vernacular building practices. As Maria Kambara points out concerning her approach, the built environment can still look contemporary without necessarily looking like something that belongs elsewhere. She emphasizes focusing on design that is embedded in the memories of the people and designs that respond to people's real lifestyles and tailor to climactic, economic, and social conditions. Can you please go to the next slide? I've been obsessed with Olaleka Jegifi's futuristic images of Lagos for years, and reading your book made me wonder if what I had read as a right to opacity in that it defamiliarizes and refuses the normative could also be read as aesthetic dissent. Its visions promote a symbiotic relationship between indigenous architecture, community, and environment. His work questions the disproportionate focus on particular types of high-rises. He argues that slums, which are often denigrated, hold important lessons for urbanists, and ignoring them would be turning away from the future. In his designs, he pays homage to indigenous aesthetic and functional aspects of slums, which are far too easily swept aside, both figuratively and literally. According to Jayufius, quote, the project examines the ways in which the nature of impoverished spaces, which are not only highly self-organized, but also deploy sustainability practices as a matter of necessity, can be applied to cities undergoing massive population growth, end quote. Next slide, please. Clearly, there are ongoing conversations on refusing the normative and rethinking spaces and practices that we considered ungeographic. Recalling these images, like the ones I just showed, and practices of some African architects made me wonder about the sorts of designs that some Angolan architects who critique normative urbanism in Luanda have proffered. And I'm curious about how you engage them in your work. So now my questions. So as I was reading your work, I found your argument about how the government how violence was repackaged as care. I found it compelling, but I was also wondering, given your strong critique of infrastructural labor and discomfort, particularly as critiquing the notion of people's infrastructure as backup. I was also wondering, given that some of the work that they do is care, could you also turn that argument around as well in terms of thinking how care then ends up being violence, if that makes sense? So that's what I was thinking. So in terms of what the sorts of things that they had to do, it's care work, but it is also in a way could be read as violence in terms of the things that they have to do, the hard labor and stuff like that. I was just curious about that. The other thing that I was curious about is that I really love your angle of making claims to urban citizenship and belonging through construction. But I was curious about urban residents who do not construct houses, like the ones, because there's still there, as you talked about, even the types of materials that they use, there's a class division. So if they don't get a chance to construct houses, can they still make claims to the urban? And in chapter 3, particularly on pages 122 and 23, I wondered about the discussions that you had there, particularly around, given that the government has already been identified as not caring about the people and those in Musikis, what are some things that enable them to have hope for the future? What if the government doesn't come with the infrastructure? What propels their belief that the government will be a caring state? And sometimes I wanted more from you. I mean, you gave a lot, but for example, how did the residents who were imagining the future and waiting for a caring state feel about being rehoused? Why didn't they end up building in the 2 years? And this was in the chapter in the chapter 3. And finally, my last question for you, or what I'm curious about, or what I've been thinking about, and I'm not sure if it's going to be clearly articulated, but I I really liked how you set the context in chapter 2 and talked about how there was a legislation that divided the population into citizens and natives, and how provisionality in many ways became a proxy for talk about a racialized native presence used as framing device in Portuguese colonial legislation to delegitimize the African urban presence. So while reading the rest of the book, I could see this continuity in the division of citizen and native, especially given that in the new Luanda, the government failed to deliver on their promises to people from the Musekes, and how African presence is still rendered provisional. Implicitly then, at least from my reading, it seemed like the new Luanda had room for the old Luanda, where world-class city aesthetic was not applicable to all of Luanda, yet it helped to continue the divisions where old Luanda could be read as African/native. And those who are elite and part of the political class have proximity to whiteness and therefore are citizens in the new Luanda. And if this is the case, then does your chapter 5 then do the work of rupturing this colonial continuity, where it is noted that the urban majority constructed the elites, particularly the political class, as foreign and refused to see them as citizens, instead arguing that they, that is urban majority are the real citizens, and their realities and concerns should be centered, and they should not be alienated from the new city. So could it be that here the native has become citizen and the citizen has become foreign, perhaps another way of thinking about native, whose presence and power should be delegitimized? So those are my things that I'm curious about, and that ends what I have to say about your book, even though I have a lot more to say. And thank you again for the wonderful, insightful interventions that you made in your book.
Thank you so much, Grace. Well, gosh, Claudia, you have two sets of comments picking up on two different parts of the book. So you get a chance to just respond to the questions or engage in a conversation about the indigeneity question and the several questions Grace raised. And then if people who are online want to keep their questions, I'll open it up after that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Those were wonderful questions. I don't know if I can do justice to all of them in the time allotted, but I will try. So I'm going to try and link Antonio's question about kind of the category of indigenous or native in Angola to kind of Grace's final question about kind of, you know, the ways in which the new city might be reproducing those divisions. And I think it kind of like almost like the short answer would be like, yes, I do think the new city is producing those divisions. And I will advertise, I'm working on a paper thinking about kind of the way in which materials, in fact, are racialized and kind of going back to that history that Antonio was talking about, in which you mentioned in terms of kind of provisionality being a proxy for kind of nativeness, or in that way for Blackness, in a sense, in the city. But to kind of start with what Antonio was saying, for those of you who either haven't read the book or don't kind of know Angolan colonial history, the Portuguese, very similar to the French, had a policy of kind of assimilation where essentially everyone who was African or of African origin was not always, but generally was classified as indigenous or native and was subject to, for instance, like forced labor, restrictions on movement in the colony. But one could apply to be reclassified as assimilated. And I think in terms of thinking how this comes together with kind of a broader concept of indigeneity, I think what is interesting when one thinks about the category of assimilated or assimilado is that it is a very, if you want, material process to prove that one is, quote unquote, assimilated or civilized. It's not just in the realm of ideas. One had to show that one had, if you want, which people such as like Jordana Matlan or Jemima Pierre have talked about kind of the materiality of race, that you had to show you could eat with a knife and fork, that your house was built of specific structures, for instance. So this was a racial project that was not just about kind of sort of a vague legal framework, but it was very materially rooted. And part of what I'm trying to track is the way that these racialized notions, which are in fact linked to kind of what is native, even under colonial law, get kind of laminated onto certain forms of building and certain materials of construction. You can see that it's in colonial legislation, but I think it remains implicitly there, and it becomes a means of already dismissing these areas. I think, in a sense, this history of assimilation and indigeneity, let's rather say indigena, because it'll get confused with the analytic term in a sense, is particularly present in Angola. But I guess part of what I'm trying to show with the book is that, in fact, in a lot of urban theory about Africa, we've in fact implicitly working with similar models. Like you'll see most books kind of frame the collapse of modernism or the modernist city as kind of the moment of crisis, right? Everything else, all other material constructions, are evidence of crisis or failure or falling apart, which then is the condition for focusing on everyday interaction as the means of survival rather than the material environment, right? So I think it's a broader conceptual framework that we are battling with when thinking about African cities. I think how that kind of comes into the present, and in many ways, Grace, you put your questions on one of the most fraught political issues in Angolan history, is kind of this question of sort of Africanity and race and belonging. And it's something that is stretched, I would say, through the 20th century history of the country. There's a fraught question of the leadership of the MPLA from early on, for instance. One of its early founders, Viriato de Cruz, who was of mixed background, advocated that the leadership should only be Black, that mixed Angolans should not be in the leadership, for instance, and actually for that position was kind of removed by Agostinho Neto, who was a Black Angolan, who said, actually, you should have like a multiracial leadership. So even in that kind of small group of elites, it's a fraught question. It's a question that was kind of mobilized during the Civil War by someone like Savimbi to say that people on the coast or the MPLA were not real Africans, were not indigenous enough. So it's a political rhetoric which is sometimes kind of latent and sometimes very explicit, but it's always there in the country to be picked up. And part of it has to do with this kind of history of enslavement, of this long relationship to the Atlantic, of kind of coastal areas being seen by many people as kind of culturally mixed, racially mixed. And a lot of people forget that after South Africa, Angola had the largest settler population in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not, in the Anglophone world, it's not very often thought of as a settler colony, but it was. And the remnants of that in terms of kind of race and are actually in some ways very similar to the Caribbean, I think, more around, certainly around like colorism and the kinds of stratifications and hierarchies that come with that. And so I think there are ways, yes, in which kind of this new Luanda is reproducing notions of kind of proximity to whiteness and hierarchy. And there is a question of who is, and I think that's what I'm pointing at, like, I'm kind of repeating what you said, because I think this is a political question that the country grapples with, is what does citizenship look like? And again, I'm going to cite Jordana Matlan's book, which everybody should read, where she really looks at this in kind of the context of Cote d'Ivoire, right? The model of the citizen, which emerges from colonialism, is in many ways this assimilated version, but it can't incorporate the majority of the population. And so what do you do? How do you cope with it when your concept of citizenship is, in fact, not representative? And this plays out through politics and plays out across the urban environment. Because once that's your model of belonging, you can't incorporate not just people, but forms and buildings and designs. And so I see that as kind of scaling up across spheres and scales. I think to kind of, I don't know, Antonio, if that's kind of satisfactory for you, or if I should, yeah. And then I think I'm kind of just going, I hadn't thought, but now that you've said it, I'm like, oh, that's so smart. Like the care work is violence, like in both directions. I'd kind of just, I guess, been thinking of it more as like, oh, this is kind of labor that is exploitative and we overlook. But I think you're right, it is care work. It's the forms of care which precisely produce the kinds of aesthetic comforts. And again, for those of you who haven't read the book, one of the arguments I make is that when we're looking at state oil spectacle, it's very often dismissed as kind of, just a performance. And one of the arguments I make is like, well, it is performative, but it's specific in its performance, if you want, that states don't just arbitrarily put up images of anything. And one of the things that the Angolan state was really trying to do was to transform the imaginations that the population had of it from that of being a wartime state to a state that could provide, and specifically could provide kind of aesthetic comfort, embodied comfort. So the images would show electricity or lights on at night or water features, right? Because these are all things that make your life more comfortable. It is much more comfortable to open a tap and get, water you can drink from it than having to kind of lug it yourself or pay someone to go fetch it or organize a tanker to come fill up your water tank. And so one of the things in the book that I'm arguing is that the state kind of implicitly or sometimes explicitly justifies mass demolitions or forms of removal by appealing to a promise of kind of future embodied comfort for the population, that's what all of this is going to produce. But there's a part where I look at kind of infrastructural lack and the ways in which the everyday kind of work of very often like the person inhabitants of the city in terms of carrying water upstairs for wealthier people or filling up generators provides the kinds of aesthetic comfort that the state claims it's going to produce, but for the wealthier. And so that's what Grace is referring to. And yes, there's kind of a structural, not just structural violence, but actually something much more physical enacted. We know that, you know, walking up 10 flights of stairs carrying, you know, what are they called? Jerry cans of water, which weigh, I don't want to imagine how much because I didn't do it because I paid somebody else to carry them. I don't exclude myself from that category, is going to wear your body down, you know. So yeah, I don't really have a response for how to theorize that, but you've opened my eyes up to something in my book which I hadn't thought about as much. So thank you very, very much for that. The right to opacity, that is, I want you to write a paper on the right to opacity. Yeah, I mean, when you put it like that, I mean, I think that's part of what I'm getting to is, and I think a lot of the book is trying to think about and trying to struggle with actually kind of the broader frameworks that we've approached African cities through. And again, like I said, that kind of early 2000s literature and rethinking the formal is so vital, but it made us ignore kind of this whole material world, which has meant that there's a whole area of politics, not just a whole area of politics, but a whole framing to the city that kind of went missing. And a lot of that has just been put under kind of human rights or civil rights, like something got knocked down, it's a human rights violation. But if you say you have a right to opacity, which is like you have a right to be noticed and to be visible, and we start to walk through a city and take note of these other formations and then think about how that would be incorporated like into architectural designs, I think that opens up like a whole world of not just kind of architectural experimentation, but political discussion. Because like, how would people design a city? And I think this then links back to what you're saying about, you know, the architects I spoke to. And I really want to say that actually almost all the architects I spoke to and many people in the Angolan state like know that imposing certain things is not good practice. It's not like these are, you know, kind of uneducated people who don't like, they're very well educated, well-informed people, the majority, by far the majority that I spoke to. But their client was the state, ultimately. Like the biggest investor was the state. There were some private investors, many of them individuals linked to the ruling party. But a lot of this was a state project, and in some aspects was highly personalized into the presidency, in terms of what even the president thought of particular projects. And I can't say too much more because some of that came out of interviews, which I can't dwell on too much because they'd be about specific projects and then it'd be easier to tell who I spoke to. I think that's the issue. The issue is not always that people don't notice. Some people don't, but I think there are key people, whether in bureaucracies or in private architectural practices, etc., that have a greater sense of the kinds of cities that might be more amenable or how to incorporate these processes, but they're not always allowed space to move by kind of the political structures. What I will say, and maybe Antonio might want to pick up on this as well, is that since José Eduardo dos Santos left in 2017, he stepped down from power and a new president came in. I don't think the new president is like a billion times better or something. That's not the direction I'm going in. But I think there have been a lot of smaller spaces for experimentation with urban form. And some of them are things familiar with other places in the world. So they're not kind of some, you know, pure form of, you know, thinking, but stuff like, you know, walks through the city and all parts of the city, like guided tours, okay? Or kind of a street market or attempt to kind of rejuvenate or regentrify an area. But I think they're interesting places to look at where kind of younger people or people who aren't always directly employed by the state, even though they may have some state backing. Angola is an oil state, and that is where the majority of the money is still. are trying to think differently. They don't run the apparatus, but I think they're interesting spaces of experimentation to look at. And I think like a project that would look at these sites of experimentation across the continent, whether it be kind of more well-known architects or kind of neighborhood initiatives, student practices, would be a really interesting project to think about.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Grace and Antonio. I actually, Grace, if I could just jump in, I think I misunderstood the right to opacity, because I wondered if the right to opacity meant the right to not be seen, the right to be private, the right to privacy. And in fact, those buildings you put up, Grace, seem to be designed to conceal rather than open up. And I kind of wondered how that related to some other debates. We were just reading Jacob Dlamini's Native Nostalgia actually in class yesterday, and he also uses the notion of the sensorium and so on. But there's very central argument that's made about some urban spaces in Johannesburg where people have no privacy, where there's a different relationship of interior and exterior life. So I understood opacity to be that, the right to not be seen by the state, to not be regulated, not be controlled, and it seemed to conflict a little with the right to privacy, which is not afforded. Was not under apartheid planning really afforded properly to Black families. Well, certainly not in the informal settlements.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, the way that I've been thinking through the right to opacity is not so much in relation to transparency to the state, but the right to opacity as I'm thinking through it in relation to what kinds of cities can we build? Like, what is the normative? So it's like, it's the right then to, or at least the way that I'm trying to stretch it, if you will, is it's the right to like not have this particular way of being familiar, right? Mm-hmm. You can defamiliarize particular ways, like which I took from Claudia's book as well, how we think about particular spaces, how we think about the built form. So I think that's how that's how I'm thinking about it, to be opaque about how you construct things, how you think about what the what the right ways of being aesthetic is, if that makes sense. Again, I could be off, but that's how I've been trying to work with it in my work. Still, again, that's why I pose it as a question to Claudia, because I'm not sure if it quite works, but yeah, so it's not in relation to it's not so much about the relationship with the state and transparency, but yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
I saw it as like the right not to be kind of looked through, right? Like, because I was like, these are areas which are kind of, and there's a book by an Angolan author on Jackie called Os Transparentes, like the transparent ones, and how people in the city, some people start becoming, like they're so neglected that they start becoming like, I mean, that's not the only reason, but like, yeah, they start becoming transparent, like, but it's kind of a metaphor. So it's been translated if you want to read it. But
we have
the right to be visible, I guess.
Right. I think it's a lot that we can do with the
okay. So I guess I was thinking more of it in terms of some of what's her name? Like some of Kara Keeling's like in terms of like I don't know. Again, I have to like go back to it because again, I wrote it this morning, but that's how like so yeah, it's not. Yeah, so Kara Keeling and some of Glissant's work. So I don't know, maybe I am doing too much with it in terms of how I'm thinking about this notion of defamiliarizing how we think through the urban and stuff like that.
We have some questions, and I'm going to, Catherine, do you want to ask your question rather than have me read it, just so we are more human in this space?
Sure, thank you so much. And it's been so interesting listening to all of you speak. And, about the book, which I haven't read yet. I wondered if you could say something about the construction, both the aesthetic aspects and obviously the political economy, but also the lived feeling of the construction that's mainly been promulgated and pushed by subcontractors from China or by direct contractors brought across from China, and all of the complexity related to that. The kind of building form, I believe that water has to be lugged up many, many stories because the water level is too low, and one could go on and on. And the reason I bring this up is because I haven't heard that discussion at all coming through. And I know that that is what is in the news a lot, in English news about Angola that I get in South Africa, and especially about Luanda, but also about some other cities. And then I wanted to try and see if I could flex from that to what difference that makes to some of the commentary about Lusophone, colonial, and settler aesthetics, histories of burdens, traumas, etc. I don't know if that makes sense, but I try to write it a little bit more reasonably because I had time to compose it. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Claudia?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, the relationship with China is central to kind of the Luanda's redevelopment and, in fact, kind of the National Reconstruction Project as a whole. Basically, just to give a little bit of background, Angola comes out of its very, very violent, very destructive war, and initially actually goes to kind of traditional lenders, EU, the US, etc., asking for kind of a donor roundtable, which had in fact happened in the early 90s with their first election when it looked like there would be kind of a longer peace. And they're turned down, well, not directly turned down. They're proposed that like this will be considered, but there will be conditionalities attached to any kind of to any aid given or money given, etc. And the Angolan state, because again, it's really important to remember that a prime actor in all of this is the state, with a president at the time who controls that state quite strongly at the upper echelons, at least, rejects this. And it rejects it for a number of reasons. I mean, the almost obvious one that people dwell on is, that if you have all these conditionalities attached, you don't have as much freedom with what you do with the money, and potentially there's fewer corruption opportunities, etc. But that's kind of the easy explanation. So part of it is that. But part of it is genuinely that this is a country that has come out of a war, a very long war, and it wants to engage in rebuilding quickly and on its own terms. And I don't think that part of the story should be overlooked or dismissed. I think they're both there. And Angola also wants to do what at the time was not popular. And this has changed. Now the US wants to invest in the Lobito corridor, but Angola was proposing something which hadn't happened on the continent for a long time, which was large-scale infrastructural development, mega projects, kind of almost like a throwback. It was discussed as such, like a throwback to the 60s or the 70s for most people. And this was mocked very often. It was criticized very heavily. And again, there are good reasons for that in terms of managing money. But on the other hand, if you're a country that has come out of a 3-decade civil war, like you do need to repair infrastructure. And I don't think, again, that is something to dismiss. And so Angola goes to China and who's in need of oil, because it's like this moment of massive kind of growth in China, need of oil and commodities, and does a much larger version of what the ruling party has been using to prop itself up during the war for decades, which is oil-backed lending. So the MPLA has been engaged in this since the 80s to import food and weapons. But this gets scaled up as a massive form. And Angola basically pioneers, to a certain extent, these large-scale infrastructure for oil deals, which are now common across Africa, not oil, but commodity for infrastructure deals. And Tom Burgess has written a very good book about this. And so China kind of becomes the key player. Angola takes out loans from China, which will be repaid at the spot price of oil for the day. And obviously at the time, this looked like a really great deal. Now that oil is not worth as much, it has left the state kind of indebted. So, it's not, but I guess what I want to highlight is this is a much more complex story than some kind of predatory Chinese state that comes in. It is a balancing of powers and a negotiation, and in some ways a necessity for a country which needs to do something post the Civil War. It does mean, and I think this is probably the most important critique, that the state uses this infrastructure to avoid having to deal with, for instance, actual reconciliation or the thorny problem of like authoritarianism and dominant, almost one-party rule. Okay, and I think these issues have emerged more in recent years as kind of DeSantis's grip on power release. So, but yes, so many of these new buildings are built by China, designed through China, but I don't think it's a substantive break from the colonial period, nor even from the post-colonial period. If you see what happens in Angola, you have kind of, or especially Luanda, and I think we need to distinguish Luanda in some ways very specific in Angola as a location. Luanda has this very long history of Portuguese colonialism. 1975, the majority of settlers leave, and Angola is really left in a position where it has to almost rebuild its state structures from scratch. And so external experts, if you want, are brought in to assist with this. And the largest group are Cubans, and the largest group of the Cubans are in construction, planning, engineering, and they rebuild infrastructure that had been destroyed during the run-up to independence. They build apartment blocks in Luanda. They help build some factories. They built some water treatment plants. So this history of kind of like a foreign presence, if you want, cooperating with the government to build is a long one. The Cubans kind of leave in the late 80s, early 90s. You have arrival of the Brazilians and kind of the design of sort of gated communities in the south of Luanda. And then in the 2000s, you have the Chinese. And so I think what for me is more useful to look at, and the argument I make, is that you have kind of a logic of trying to destroy Musex, which stretches across these eras. And so the political economy, the specific kind of players, political economies, ideologies, they do matter because they matter to kind of who's involved at the time. But at a larger kind of structural level, you have the same logic, which you can see in kind of writings of Cuban engineers at the time about the necessity to destroy these areas in order to build what the city should be. Now, for the Cubans and their leadership at the time, the destruction is necessary to bring about like a new socialist man to deliver on the promises of socialism. So it's not always like an evil intent driving it per se, but the assumption that these are areas that don't have substantive material histories of design, they're not rooted in a real urbanism, stretches across all of these. And so part of what the claim that I'm making is that you do have what is ultimately like a formalizing sort of settler colonial logic built into the way that that formal city expands, because it can't recognize and will not recognize kind of the worth of an indigenous urbanism that in fact emerged at the same time as it, not even after it, like literally in parallel. And so the question becomes, how does one live with that? How does one incorporate that? So
Thanks, Claudia. Sorry, but I see Jackie Solway wants to ask a question. Jackie?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I've really enjoyed this. Claudia, I have a comment. Some years ago, I read a book, and I assume you're probably familiar with it, called Luxury and Rubble by Eric Harms, Vietnam. And he's talking about urban development and housing and buildings and so on in Saigon. And there's a kind of counterintuitive argument I was very struck by, in that those people, I guess you'd call them slum dwellers or whatever, whose homes were being destroyed, were being made rubble, were, being dispossessed for this, rather than resisting or fighting it or so on, he suggests that they take pride in it. And because it's a sign, it's an aspirational sign of modernity and something they can be proud of, that their country's coming up. And I'm curious the extent to which you found that kind of sentiment. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that question.
I mean, again, even though they were dispossessed, yeah.
Yeah, no, I know Eric Ham's work, and I cite it, and I think there is some of that sentiment, and it probably hasn't come across as much in the talk, but part of what I'm trying, I kind of bounce off him and some work by Philippe de Boeck and others, which has made this argument that you have kind of urban dwellers who know that they're going to be kind of the losers, if you want, in this game of urban redevelopment, but still kind of aspire for these buildings. And part of my answer is that yes, but people have a complexity of aesthetic desires. So there's nothing about saying like, wow, I'm really impressed by the promises of that building. Look, it has electricity, it has running water, it's comfortable inside, it's going to have a lawn where my children can play, and still taking pride in what you have. And so I guess it might just be like an ethnographic difference in terms of what we encountered in the field. What I encountered in Luanda was people saying, look, like, I built here first. The state wasn't here before. I built this. I employed someone to build it. I spent this amount of money on it. I've invested in this, and this has made me as a person. I have a claim to this space. I have, if not a legal right, I don't think people always went as far to say they had a legal right, but they had kind of a right of recognition or something that was mutually recognized, which rooted them and gave them what I say is like an indigenous urban claim that they were a forerunner of the state. And so when the state came to demolish, what people wanted, in some sense, the political issue was like a recognition of that. So, okay, if you're going to move me, where are you moving? Are you going to give me compensation? What is the nature of that compensation? I don't like the house you're offering, for instance. The house looks wrong. The house I currently have is better than what you're offering. So it might just be kind of literally like an ethnographic difference. But what I found was a much more complex aesthetic politics, like an aesthetic politics which looked at these kind of spectacles and did find them aspirational in many ways, but was also able to criticize them. And I kind of talk about this in the chapter that Grace was talking about aesthetic dissent. So people talked about how, okay, high rise is great, it's beautiful, etc., but I run a business from my yard, and that architectural form can't incorporate that. So if you move me, what are you going to do about that business? Where is the space where I can kind of treat, where I can run a school or a medical business? Maybe people don't want people running medical businesses in their yards, but was the case, or my restaurant, or just like hang out with my friends because the other place doesn't have a balcony or a veranda. So there was a very keen understanding of what architectural form enabled from people who have really not been treated, I would say, by most urban writing as if they would have that keen sense of architectural form. And so that is what I picked up on, which is different to what someone like Eric Ham's found in Vietnam. And yeah, it might just be a difference in locational place or history. I don't think he's lying about what he found. I just think I found something different.
I think it's in part a matter of emphasis. And thank you very much for your answer. That was really interesting.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one last question or comment. If anybody would like to pick up on any of this very, very rich discussion. People are beginning to leave, I think, because we have a class beginning soon. the usual problem with these scheduling, scheduling a seminar in the middle of the day and you can't all go off down, have a drink, would be very difficult. We're in 3 different countries. If not, I want to just say thank you very, very much to Claudia for a fascinating book. I urge you all to read it. Available now. I don't know how much it costs, but it's definitely worth every cent of it, Claudia. Well done on a great book. And there's so many elements to it, actually, that we could go on talking about. I certainly want to have a bigger discussion with you about indigeneity and about the sort of African versus North American uses of those concepts, which just, I think, a real challenges to us in Africa in the way in which we use the term. But I think it's just a fabulously rich book. Thank you. Thank you to Antonio and Grace for their great comments and the feeling that you really engaged this book and have a part in the ideas surrounding the book. Look forward to seeing all of you next week for the final seminar, which is on Children of the Soil, Tasha Reka Epstein's book on Madagascar, and that I think is going to be a really lovely way to end this year. Thank you all. And yeah, take care and happy Thanksgiving to those who celebrated.
Thank you. Thank you to Grace and Antonio and Shireen.